It's January, and many people expect lifestyle habits to form quickly, sometimes just in a few weeks. But when change starts to feel hard, motivation dips, and days are missed, a common question appears: why isn't this working yet? To answer that honestly, we need to look at what science actually shows about habit formation because the real answer is far less simple than most popular advice suggests. Many of us grew up hearing that it takes 21 days to form a habit. What's interesting is that this number did not come from studies on habits or behavior change. It goes back to the 1960s when a plastic surgeon named Dr. Maxwell Maltz noticed that many of his patients took around 3 weeks to psychologically adjust to physical changes such as surgery or limb loss. These were careful personal observations, but they were never meant to describe how habits form. Over time, that idea was repeated, simplified, and gradually turned into a general rule about habits. Only later did researchers begin studying habit formation directly by carefully observing behavior over time. To understand how long habits actually take to form, it helps to look at research that brings many studies together. In 2024, Singh and colleagues published a scientific review that analyzed 20 different studies involving 2,601 participants, all focused on everyday health related habits. These included behaviors such as physical activity, healthy diet, drinking water regularly, taking vitamins, flossing, reducing sedentary time, and other small repeated actions that people try to build into daily life. Rather than relying on single examples or personal experiences, this type of review allows us to look for consistent patterns across many people over time. Now, before we get into what they found, it helps to clarify what scientists actually mean when they talk about a habit. In research, a habit doesn't mean doing something perfectly or never missing a day. Instead, a habit is defined as the point where a behavior starts to feel more automatic, where it requires less conscious effort and fits more naturally into daily life. You can think of it as the behavior beginning to run more on routine than on constant motivation, almost like a gentle autopilot. This is the point researchers focus on and what the time estimates in the next slides are based on. With that definition in mind, we can now look at what the studies actually observed. In one of the studies included in this review, which followed people trying to build healthy eating habits, the median time to reach this habit point was 59 days. In simple terms, that means about half of the participants reached this stage in under 2 months and half took longer. So, this number isn't a deadline, it gives us a sense of the time scale over which habit formation often begins. What's reassuring is that this pattern did not appear in just one study. Another study included in the same review, which looked at habits like healthy eating, drinking water, and physical activity, found a very similar result. Here, the median time to reach this habit point was 66 days. Taken together, these findings suggest that habit formation usually unfolds over weeks to months rather than days, and that consistency matters more than speed. Furthermore, when researchers looked more closely at individual timelines, they saw something equally important. The range was very wide. In these studies, the time to reach this habit point ranged from as little as 4 days to as long as 335 days. This widespread reflects real differences between people, their routines, environments, and the kinds of habits they were trying to build. This kind of variation is a normal part of how habits develop, but it also raises an important question: why do some habits settle in faster than others? One important factor is the type of habit itself, whether it's relatively simple or more complex. To explore this, Buyalskaya and colleagues published a large study in 2023 in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Rather than relying on short experiments, this research examined habit formation using real world behavioral data at a scale far larger than most earlier studies. The researchers compared two very different everyday behaviors. One was hand washing in hospitals, a behavior that is short, relatively simple, and strongly linked to clear environmental cues. The other was going to the gym, a behavior that typically requires planning, time, physical effort, and sustained motivation. When the researchers followed these behaviors over time, a clear difference emerged. Going to the gym typically took around 2 to 3 months to become a habit, while hand washing in hospitals often settled within weeks. This doesn't mean complex habits are weaker or less valuable, it simply reflects that they demand more effort, planning, and flexibility from day to day. And here's one of the most reassuring and hopeful findings from this research. Once a habit becomes stable, it starts to require less motivation. People become less sensitive to reminders or rewards because the brain begins to run the behavior on autopilot. It becomes more predictable in familiar situations. In simple terms, habits eventually protect you from the daily ups and downs in motivation. The behavior no longer depends entirely on willpower. The effort you're investing now is teaching your brain how to support you later. And before we end, one last thing the research makes very clear. Habits don't form just because we try harder, they form more easily when the conditions are right. Across many studies, a few factors consistently helped habits strengthen. For example, choosing the habit yourself when the goal feels personally meaningful, not imposed. Another important factor is keeping the context stable, doing the behavior at the same time in the same place whenever possible. Further, starting the simpler versions of the behavior also mattered rather than aiming for perfection from the start. And finally, finding some level of enjoyment in the behavior itself. These aren't tricks or hacks, they are ways of working with the brain instead of fighting it. And they remind us that habit formation isn't about discipline alone, it's about design, patience, and kindness towards self. So, before we close, I want to leave you with this thought, especially if you're watching this in January. If you've started something recently and it already feels slow, uneven, or fragile, that's not a sign that it isn't working. Most habits don't grow in straight lines, they grow quietly with pauses, restarts, and small adjustments along the way. The research we looked at today doesn't tell us to push harder, it tells us to stay longer and stay consistent, and often that's enough.